we're here for Class 10 for Introduction to Judaism, RE204. Welcome back after reading week. Today, so in Lecture 9, we began our unit on the Jewish Middle Ages, and we began with a discussion of sort of diversity in global Israel throughout the Middle Ages. Today in Class 10, we're going to be looking at social and religious cohesion in the Jewish Middle Ages, particularly, and we'll be especially focusing on Rabbinic Judaism from now on in the Middle Ages. And Rabbinic Judaism throughout the Middle Ages had a surprising level of cohesion despite it being in diaspora, which is spread out throughout the Middle Ages. We tend to think of the Middle Ages as an era, before modern technology, before modern travel, before modern communication, but yet Judaism in the Middle Ages, at least among Rabbinic Jews, actually was quite cohesive in the Middle Ages, and the Middle Ages is often referred to as sort of the most cohesive period of Jewish history. So that's what we're going to be focusing on today, keeping in mind, of course, all of the factors for diversity that we saw in Class 9, and we'll see some more factors today, even as we explore cohesion and more throughout this unit. I am Holly, or Dr. Pierce, as you prefer. Now that reading week is over, I will be back to my open office hours for you for this course. That's Thursdays at 4 via Zoom. If you need me, you can come see me then. Okay, so for week 5, which started before reading week and is now ending today, we started Unit 2, got into the Middle Ages, and are now into Jewish uniformity. And as I said, within each cultural region, and for Rabbinic Judaism, even across cultural regions, there is a notable, surprising presence of uniformity within Judaism and Jewish practice throughout this period that makes this period distinct. The modern period is very diverse. The ancient period, as we saw, was very diverse. And the Middle Ages for the Jews is actually a period of surprising uniformity. Today we're going to look at a few factors how that uniformity came about, and we're going to be specifically looking a bit at isolation and autonomy, and particularly the codification of Judaism as well as the perpetuation of the community. So those are some of the areas that fostered this cohesion and motivated this cohesion into what Jacob Neusner calls sort of the age of cogency throughout the Middle Ages. Again, the Middle Ages is often a period that's overlooked when people discuss Judaism and Jewish history sort of briefly. They look at the biblical period, the ancient period, that sort of formative period where ancient Israelite or Hebrew religion becomes Judaism. They look at the classical period under the Greeks and the Romans. And then they pick it up often again with the creation of the denominations in the modern period. So a lot of the times when you look at overviews of Judaism, the Middle Ages are sort of skimmed over as if there isn't a great deal of innovation and a great deal of change that goes on in the Middle Ages. But there is. We have 2,000 years, about at least 1,000 from about 4th or 5th century till about the 1600s is what I'm talking about when I talk about the Middle Ages. There is a great deal of innovation. There's a great deal of productivity that goes on in the Middle Ages. If people talk about the Middle Ages, generally speaking, they talk about persecution. And this is a major factor in the Middle Ages. Persecution is particularly salient to the discussion of Judaism and Jewish life in the Middle Ages. But that's not all there is. So in the Jewish Middle Ages, we're looking at a state of diaspora after the loss of the temple in 70 CE and the fall of the Bar Kokhba revolt in 135 CE. The Romans effectively scattered the Jews throughout the Roman Empire and elsewhere. Now, this isn't the beginning of what is often referred to as the exile or diaspora. As we know, many people did not return from the Babylonian exile, and there were also communities before the Babylonian exile, such as the Ethiopian communities. So, diaspora is not a new state. We often refer to as the Great Diaspora as everything happening after 135 CE, which would include the Middle Ages. But diaspora is a state that the Jews were already in at the time of the Great Diaspora. And as we've explored, that's one of the ways that Jews survived the Great Diaspora, is because of the great academies and communities in the Babylonian community that had money and books and authority and teachers. This is one of the ways the Jews survived the tragedy of 70 CE. So when we look at the Middle Ages, we're looking at a series of, pros and cons, I guess. We're looking at a series of events that were good for the Jews and not so good for the Jews. The Middle Ages is marked by productivity, it's marked by religious devotion, it's marked by faith, it's marked by an incredible amount of artistic output, but it's also marked by tragedy. The Judaism in the Middle Ages is predominantly marked by rabbinic Judaism, which becomes solidified and dominant in this period and becomes really entrenched in Jewish family life and becomes part of the way people are Jews. For the majority of Jews in the Middle Ages, this is the period in which rabbinic Judaism becomes Jewish ways or minhag or ways of the elders. Judaism in the Middle Ages is also marked by a state of diaspora, and unfortunately, in the Middle Ages, for many places, this was also a period of persecution, isolation, expulsions, exclusions, and so forth, and the advent of anti-Semitism, which is the irrational hatred of the Jews as a people and the resulting harassment or mistreatment or discrimination that comes from that irrational hatred. But there continues to be religious and theological productivity. And although rabbinic Judaism is the dominant form of Judaism for most Jews throughout this period, it starts to take on different flavors. And what we looked at in Lecture 9 specifically, or most significantly, most visibly, I should say, are the Ashkenazi traditions, the Sephardic traditions, and the Mizrahi traditions. The Judaism that develops within Christian Europe, the Ashkenazi tradition, the Judaism that develops within Islamic Spain, the Sephardic tradition, and the Judaism that develops to the east, the Mizrahi tradition. So many of these groups are still rabbinic Jews. So Mizrahi and Sephardic and Ashkenazi don't represent denominations of Judaism, but instead you should think of them as flavors. The culture bereichs that we talked about in Lesson 9, the regional cultural ways of being Jewish. Because throughout the Middle Ages, Judaism coexisted, lived under its two main colleague faiths. That's the Abrahamic faiths of Christianity and Islam. And Judaism is obviously shaped by Christianity and Islam throughout the Middle Ages. And that's one of the reasons, the biggest reasons why Ashkenazi Judaism develops differently than Sephardic Judaism, for example, because of the influence of Christianity and Islam, respectively. But don't worry, we will actually spend a week on Judaism under Christianity and another week on Judaism under Islam, and we'll look more specifically at those things throughout this unit. Nonetheless, Jacob Neusner, a really sort of a seminal figure within early Jewish studies throughout the 60s, 70s, 80s, so before my time, thank you very much. But my teachers were basically learning from Neusner's work in many ways. So Neusner was a pretty influential figure in Jewish studies. And he referred to the Middle Ages as the Age of Cogency, so a period from about the 600s to the 1800s, although Some people would put that earlier to the 1700s. So this is a period in which Judaism is relatively uniform, stable, unified predominantly under Rabbinic Judaism. So the Age of Cogency is a time in which Judaism comes together. It stabilizes after the disaster and the formative period that we looked at in Unit 1, and then it becomes rooted within Judaism, within Jewish families. And there are many, many factors that led to the dominance of Rabbinic Judaism. If you remember from the Second Temple period and from the reconstruction after 70 CE, Jews could have picked any number of Judaisms. Rabbinic Judaism obviously had the edge because they had the foresight to protect their documents and get their scholars out of Jerusalem and establish academies throughout the diaspora to preserve the tradition. So that gave them a very practical edge, but there are also ideological, textual, and authoritative reasons why Rabbinic Judaism becomes dominant for the Jews in this period. Obviously the text, they had a core, foundational, central core of texts, obviously Torah, the Tanakh, but also Mishnah and Talmud. These made sort of a really portable yet incredibly stable foundation for Jewish communities. So it was a practical tool for survival in the diaspora. And of course, with these texts, the emphasis on these texts comes an emphasis on Hebrew education, which, as we looked at in the Babylonian exile as well, is a major factor in the prevention of assimilation. If you teach children an ancestral language, if you have a great emphasis on an ancestral language in education, this can be a tool to prevent assimilation and loss of those children. And the way that authority was passed on in Rabbinic Judaism was also advantageous. Authority was in the hands of rabbis and not an inherited priesthood. So it's closer to a meritocracy. Individuals could become rabbis, individual men in this period could become rabbis not because of their bloodline necessarily, although there were rabbinic dynasties in which fathers and sons and grandsons all became famous rabbis. That was not the norm or the expectation. Rabbis were simply humans, not divine in any way, not better than other people, although individual rabbis were obviously seen sometimes as being good people or even better people. The title of rabbi itself doesn't come with any type of divinity. Rabbis were simply people who lived amongst the Jews. They were Jews themselves who lived amongst the Jews and who claimed authority through knowledge and through the ability to work with the law. And this form of authority was really useful in precarious situations because you could trust the authority of the authorities, because they knew what they were talking about. And this authority stemmed through an academy system where rabbis were incredibly well trained for this period. It wasn't simply a matter of someone deciding they had a calling to become a rabbi and simply calling themselves a rabbi. There was an intense sort of scrutiny of rabbis and their qualifications, which is very useful in a period in which rabbis are essential to the preservation of Judaism. This also led to not only the dominance of Rabbinic Judaism, but also the uniformity of Judaism in this period. Now, the other big factors for the dominance of Rabbinic Judaism are actually ideological. There were ideological reasons why Rabbinic Judaism was so compelling for Jews in this period. Now, we haven't really talked a lot about the persecution Jews suffered during this period, but it is quite extensive, particularly within Christian Europe, but also other places as well. So the fact that Rabbinic Judaism is essentially a pro-social religion was very helpful. So it was very community-oriented, it was very help-oriented, and it was very charity-based. And in times of strife, in times of precariousness, religions that emphasize charity have a practical effect of preserving life, that widows and orphans and people who are injured are taken care of by the community. These things are advantageous during times of trouble. Rabbinic Judaism also emphasizes study and the preservation of tradition, but also emphasizes life and survival and the preservation of life. Because having seen the destructions of 70 CE and 73 CE with the tragedy at Masada, and 135 and the fall of the Bar Kokhba revolt and the resulting deaths from that, Rabbinic Judaism really became insular, became focused on Jewish survival. It became not on Jewish power, but on Jewish survival and the preservation of Jewish life. And it became inward focused, focusing on the synagogue, yes, but most importantly on the family and the family's connection to the community. And these things sort of helped build an ideological wall for Jews that kept people safe within the community and within families, kept the tradition preserved within families and communities, but to some extent insulated the Jews from the sort of chaos that was going on around them throughout the Middle Ages. And further, theologically speaking, Rabbinic Judaism emphasized trust in God's mercy and justice. So no matter what was happening to the Jews at the time, Rabbinic Judaism offered them something to hold on to in terms of trusting that God was always merciful and just, even if I'm going through tragedy or persecution or expulsion. I know God is merciful and just. God will allow a remnant of the Jews to survive anything. So even if I die, I know the Jews will survive, which Jews drew an immense amount of comfort from in the Middle Ages. And this emphasis on trust in God's mercy and justice and the survival of the people led to the cultivation of patience and persistence and resilience amongst the Jews in the Middle Ages. Three things that they really needed to survive the Middle Ages. And this belief in God, this dedication in God, this personal spirituality, this personal relationship with God, infused all Jewish life, even in suffering, with some kind of meaning, some kind of purpose, some kind of greater hope throughout the Jewish Middle Ages that is incredibly necessary for Jews to survive the Middle Ages. When we get into the persecutions of the Middle Ages, there may be times when you ask yourself, why would anyone want to persist in being a Jew if they have to go through these things? And Rabbinic Judaism offered this sense of meaning that gave people a reason to continue under the conditions that they went through. So just a reminder, Rabbinic Judaism, which we can also call Talmudic Judaism, is not the only form of Judaism. So Rabbinic Judaism means Judaism as devised by the rabbis, with authority placed in the hands of rabbis. And Talmudic Judaism is Rabbinic Judaism. It is Judaism that is focused on Talmud as its foundation, and the Talmud as a source of rabbinic authority. But it's not the only form of Judaism, and I'm going to keep reminding you of that because Rabbinic Judaism was so successful at becoming dominant throughout this period that people do tend to forget that there are other forms of Judaism. So I'm going to try to keep myself reminded and keep you reminded. So within Rabbinic Judaism, obviously, the study of Talmud, the Mishnah and the commentary thereof that comprises Talmud, is sort of the core lifelong pursuit within Rabbinic Judaism, particularly for people who become rabbis. But one of the distinctive things about Rabbinic Judaism is the very strong belief that you cannot concentrate Jewish learning only in the hands of authority. Every Jew has to be educated within Judaism, Jewish history, Jewish law, and Jewish practice to the best of their and their family's ability. After the devastation of 70 CE, you can see why Rabbinic Jews decided we're not going to put all of our tradition in one basket. We're going to make sure every Jew knows some as much as they possibly can. So education becomes a core practice of Rabbinic Judaism. Talmud Torah, to learn and to teach, becomes the central foundational activities of rabbis and of Jews in general. And yeshiva, that is the academy in which a rabbi learns to become a rabbi, is not just closed to people with the money and the skill that it takes to become a rabbi. Rabbinic training is not exclusive to rabbis. Many Jews underwent some level of rabbinic training, even if they never actually attained the level of rabbi, which effectively means my master or master of the law. So at 3... particularly Jewish boys, but not all. Some communities also include Jewish girls in this. At 3, they begin to learn the Hebrew alphabet. At 6, they begin to learn the Bible. At older, according to their skills, they begin to learn Talmud. They prepare for their bar mitzvah, that is the coming of age ceremony for boys, in which they would become responsible to the law. And at that point, many Jewish boys would then go on to learn a trade, enter regular life. But those boys that had the skill and money, because sometimes rabbinic training was, you did need money to become a rabbi. There was community support for poor boys that had the skills to become rabbis, but there was a certain amount of privilege involved with being able to stay in yeshiva and stay in school. But those boys that could stay in yeshiva then continued training in Talmud and training in Halakha, the law of Judaism, to become rabbis. But this is the way in which rabbinic Judaism becomes systematic or endemic within Jewish communities. Through education. Now, what I've described there is formal education. You should also note that there was an incredible amount of informal education going on in Judaism at this time, as there is now. Children literally learned Judaism at the home, watching their mothers in the kitchen, watching their fathers at daily prayer, not just in the synagogue, but in the home. There is a great deal of informal learning that goes on. And if you encourage your entire population, your entire community to have as strong a Jewish education as they can have, this also fosters a more Jewish educational environment for Jewish children right from birth. As Josephus, the first century Jewish historian, put it, Jews began to learn Judaism at their mother's breast, and this became central to rabbinic Judaism as well, that Jewish lives should be led Jewishly, and Jewish education is both formal and informal, taking place within organized structures as well as the home. So halakha means a way of going, or it comes from the Hebrew, he went. So the Jewish way, you can think of halakha as the Jewish way of doing things. As one rabbi put it, there's a Jewish way to tie shoes. So Jewish way, or Jewish law, the oral and the written law, that can be interpreted, must be interpreted by halakhic authorities. So rabbis that we see in the Talmud, rabbis and poseks. Poseks are people who answer religious questions. In responsa literature, which are letters largely answering religious questions. Halakha is how rabbinic Judaism survives the Middle Ages. Halakha may sound like it's very firm. It's very rigid, right? The law. But halakha and halakhic process actually is very fluid. It's actually very flexible. Rabbinic Judaism understood that the Bible was very, very old. And in order to make an old document apply to medieval context or modern context, you need halakha, which is the process in which educated, dedicated, devoted people can master the material and then interpret it for unique circumstances. So halakhic authority was invested in the rabbis and the poseks and the bet din. The bet din are sort of like little Sanhedrins. They're religious courts that rabbis or committees of rabbis preside over to help people live Jewishly in whatever context they're in. And how to apply the 613 mitzvah or commandments that are found in Torah throughout Jewish life. Now, you may have heard 10 commandments, 613 commandments within Rabbinic Judaism. That's the official count of the commandments that we find in Torah. So how to apply all of those can be pretty complicated. Now, Rabbinic tradition isn't just halakha. There's also agadah, which is non-legal tradition, but also pretty important. That's Jewish folklore is often found in agadah. But agadah is also something that rabbis have to master in order to understand Judaism well enough to apply Judaism. So halakha and the ability to go through the halakhic process is really about knowledge and education, memory, and understanding. So you don't just memorize, you also have to understand not just the letter of the law, but what the law is about, what the spirit of the law is. You also have to have the ability to teach that law and to apply that law. And that's a lot of skills. Added to this, the requirement that you have empathy and compassion and that you understand human life. Rabbis had a pretty high requirement in terms of sort of what we could consider an understanding of psychology, an understanding of what it's like to be a parent, what it's like to be a spouse, what it's like to be a son or a daughter, what it means to be a human in a community. So it's not just the letter of the law or even the spirit of the law, it's also sort of the spirit of compassion required. Halakha is not literal within the rabbinic tradition. So Torah is considered perfect in Jewish tradition, but it is not necessarily meant to be read literally, word for word. Jews, by and large, are not traditionally literalists, at least wise, not in rabbinic Judaism. And in fact, it's recognized that those 613 commandments are in many cases impossible to apply literally, particularly if many of those laws apply to the temple and the temple no longer exists. That's a example of how Torah cannot be lived literally. Instead, rabbis employed a series of halakhic processes, and I am taking a long time to do these few slides, so I'm not going to give you a lot of detail about the halakhic process, except I will give you one. This is often called the Pardesh. I don't know if you can see that. P-A-R-D-E-S with the P-R-D and S capitalized. Pardes means heaven or paradise, and it's an acrostic. So you can use this device to remember Peshat, Remez, Darash, and Sod. Now these are four of the major exegetical processes of rabbinic Judaism. Exegetical largely means the way in which you understand a text in relationship to other texts, or that you can analyze a text by reading other texts with it. And obviously that's a really important thing in Judaism because there are a lot of texts and they're all seen as important. So if you master the text, you're able to read them in concert. So Peshat means plain. That's like the surface meaning of a text that you're reading. Remez means hints. So that is hints in the texts that are deep or allegorical or metaphorical or symbolic, that connect to other concepts or ideas. Darash means to seek, and that is comparison, how to look at other texts, to compare for links and connections, or the assumption is that authors place in the texts connections to other texts. And sod, which means secret. And this is the element where a good authoritative rabbi comes in, because in the act of interpretation there are also moments of inspiration. The inspirational element is what you get from a good rabbi. So they look the plain surface. You need to know what the text says. You need on the surface. You need to know what it means allegorically or symbolically or metaphorically. You need to know what it says in concert with other texts. And you also have to have a certain level of faith and dedication and goodness and compassion that gives you the element of inspiration. And this is why a computer couldn't replace a rabbi. It takes a human level of inspiration and imagination to be able to apply a 3,000-year-old law to modern life, for example. There is the human inspirational element there. So authority means the ability to know halakha and understand it, which is different from knowing it, and then be able to apply it with compassion. So authority for rabbis stems from the combination of discipline, the discipline that it takes to acquire this type of education, with compassion. And then add to that lots of study, lots of life experience, and wisdom that comes with living as a human amongst humans and loving humans and trying to understand them. So there is within Rabbinic Judaism a really flexible relationship between uniformity and dissent. Within Talmudic Judaism, dissent isn't the enemy of uniformity. Dissent, as long as those dissenting or disagreeing opinions come from valid sources, they are still included in Talmudic Judaism. It's important for a Jew when they're studying an issue to read multiple different opinions on that, even if you believe some of those opinions are misguided or incorrect. Authority is a matter of validity of one's position or validity of one's qualifications to have an opinion. It doesn't necessarily make your opinion always correct, or it doesn't mean that everyone's going to agree with your opinion. So in the Talmud, we get a great deal of polysemy, that is multiple voices recorded even if they disagree. This might sound like this is actually an enemy to uniformity, but actually it makes Talmudic Judaism and therefore Rabbinic Judaism uniquely flexible and therefore uniquely serviceable for the survival of Judaism in the Middle Ages. You include dissenting voices, and people can read those dissenting voices, and they can use their brain and their education to explore different opinions on things. Authority within Judaism gives rise to orthodoxy and orthopraxy. Orthodoxy means right belief or correct belief, or in this instance, a uniform belief. And orthopraxy means right practices or uniform practices. Because authorities were well trained within the Middle Ages, they were able to bestow to people orthopraxy or right practices, and to some extent right beliefs. Although within Judaism, correct beliefs there's a lot of leeway for correct beliefs. There's a lot of leeway given for personal thought and personal freedom within beliefs. So there is a lot of variety within Talmudic Judaism to begin with. So when we say Rabbinic Judaism dominated in the Middle Ages, this is not to say people all believe the same thing. There is a great deal of variety within the age of cogency. The cogency and coherence comes from the fact that Rabbinic Judaism was dominant, not that Rabbinic Judaism controlled everything that everyone believed and thought. There is a diversity of practice and a diversity of opinion, acceptable opinion within the Middle Ages. And of course, there is a growing diversity of minhag, or family practices, ancestral practices, throughout this period, as we've already looked at. One of the big factors for uniformity in the Middle Ages is the drive to codify rabbinic tradition. And this really culminates, this is late Middle Ages, but still we can consider the Shulchan Aruch to be one of the great, if not the greatest, work to come out of the Jewish Middle Ages. And many people consider it to be akin to the Talmud. It is itself a sacred text of Judaism. Less well known, you may have never heard of the Shulchan Aruch before, but for the Jews in the Middle Ages, and coming out of the Middle Ages, the Shulchan Aruch is akin to Talmud in terms of its sacredness. So we're still adding to the canon of sacred texts, really, in the Middle Ages. So the Shulchan Aruch is a 4-volume code of rabbinic Jewish law that was written by, compiled. He took sources, he used his own sources, and we'll look closer at the Shulchan Aruch in a few weeks. But Yosef Karo produced this massive 4-volume codification of all Jewish law into 4 easy to use topics. So ritual law is the first volume. Second volume is sort of the laws that govern everyday life, such as kosher laws and laws of mourning and charity and things of that nature. The third volume is family law, marriage and divorce, and things relating to parenting. And the fourth volume is civil law, financial and legal matters. So this made Jewish law more accessible to people. It made it standardized in a way. And particularly because the Shulchan Aruch has a secret weapon. Yosef Karo writes the Shulchan Aruch, this set table, is what it's translates to, a set table of Sephardic interpretations of rabbinic law, because he himself was Sephardic. He comes from the Jewish tradition that grows out of Islamic Spain. So the Shulchan Aruch may have only appealed to Sephardic Jews had not Moses Serlis out of Poland been working on a codification of his own at the same time, heard that Yosef Karo had published this massive work and went, well, damn, he made it there first. And then realized, well, he's coming from the Sephardic tradition, I'm coming from the Ashkenazi tradition, and it becomes published together as Yosef Karo's Shulchan Aruch, the set table, and Isserlis's mappa, or tablecloth, for the set table, which is an Ashkenazi commentary to Karo's Sephardic Shulchan Aruch. And these things together make the Shulchan Aruch basically become the core of Orthodox Judaism. It becomes the central core of what we consider now to be Orthodoxy. And the Shulchan Aruch becomes the subject of rabbinic examinations within rabbinic Judaism. So it becomes an incredibly important text. A good reminder that not all sacred texts, not all important texts were written in the time before authors. Here we have a really important text that we also have a really good history for as well. So it's a landmark of medieval Judaism. It's a meeting point between Ashkenazi and Sephardic tradition, and a key to standardizing rabbinic Judaism. So it's part of the cogency, it's part of the coming together and the stabilizing and the rendering systematic of rabbinic Judaism. And it becomes even more useful with the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, which is a shorter summary that was published. It was abbreviated and summarized for home use, which made it more portable, it made it more affordable, it made it more direct and simple, it made it more practical. So we have the big Shulchan Aruch being studied by rabbis and being tested on by rabbis, and then the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch that people were actually using in their homes. So this systematizing of Judaism is part of why we talk about a good deal of cohesion in the Jewish Middle Ages. So we have this situation of diaspora, of spreading out, that could have led to fragmentation, but Rabbinic Judaism prevented fragmentation by offering stability, by offering a core of tradition, and in a sense creating what we now refer to as the imagined community of global Israel. So people felt socially cohesive with Jews around the world by practicing in similar ways, praying in similar ways, and viewing their origins and their sense of identity in similar ways. Now, identity becomes incredibly central to Jewish survival in the Middle Ages. We get a systematizing of what it means to be a Jew and what it means to feel like a Jew, what it means to have Jewish identity. We get increased prohibitions against conversion, against intermarriage, and even against interaction with non-Jews in many ways. And certainly a lot of work put into preventing or prohibiting assimilation of children and keeping them Jewish, keeping them within Judaism. Now, I would love to say that this was purely voluntary. I would love to say that this was purely the work of Jews preserving their tradition. This is not so. A lot of sense of Jewish isolation and alienation in the Middle Ages actually comes down to law. It wasn't just the Jews prohibiting intermarriage and assimilation and conversion and interaction. In many cases, particularly throughout Europe, but in other places as well, Jews were actually actively, legally prohibited from having extensive interactions with non-Jews, largely through the application of ghetto regulations throughout the Middle Ages. And we'll talk more about the ghetto and what ghettos mean. So we get within the Jewish community a desire to preserve the community, but we also get within Jewish communities a sort of a solidarity in persecution. And we get forced isolation and alienation in the Middle Ages due to anti-Semitic laws. And this situation is terrible. It's a tragedy. I don't want to say this is a silver lining, but anti-Semitism in the wider community led to larger social cohesion amongst the Jews simply as a means to survival. Jews were tolerated within much of the Middle Ages, but not always happily. Jews had a pretty precarious legal status in many places throughout the Middle Ages. And we will talk more about those when we look at when we take our weeks on Judaism under Christianity and Judaism under Islam. Precariousness sets the tone, really, for the Jewish Middle Ages. This idea that we have a community, but next week, next month, the powers that be may expel us or murder us. This is one of the dominant tones of the Middle Ages. So Rabbinic Judaism really becomes sort of the foundation or the central pillar of medieval Judaism for most Jewish communities. Common Judaism in the Middle Ages consists of continuity with those central pillars of ancient Judaism that we talked about, the reforms of Ezra, or the innovations of Ezra after the Babylonian exile. So making Sabbath and kosher regulations mandatory, encouraging Torah reading and communal prayer, the prohibition against intermarriage, and the enforcing of ethical monotheism. These all remain central pillars of continuity in common Judaism in the Middle Ages. Rabbinic Judaism presents a specific, easy-to-follow, codified instruction for living Jewishly in the diaspora, and this becomes entrenched in daily Jewish life. So we have Rabbinic Judaism, the elite form that was taught in the academies, but we also get a domestic form of Rabbinic Judaism that becomes really central to common Judaism for most Jews in the Middle Ages. And this involves a trickle-down use of rabbinic law, rabbinic legal codes, rabbinic opinion. As people learn from rabbis, they taught each other effectively. And the isolation and alienation of Jews and the ghettoization of Jews led to a certain amount of autonomy of Jewish communities and self-governance, where rabbis were actually able to handle a lot of interactions between Jews within the ghetto, using the Bet Din, using rabbinic legal codes, using halakha. So we also have with that isolation and alienation, we also have a good level of autonomy happening in this period. So our triad of Judaism that we looked at in Unit 1, for the Middle Ages, we have God, unified, ethical monotheism. Within the Middle Ages, there is no longer question of strict monotheism. There's no henotheism going on in the Middle Ages. That God is one, God is just, God is merciful and loving, He has compassion, He sees the Jews, He remembers the Jews. But we also get a sense in the Middle Ages that God is somewhat unknowable, that humans can't really understand what God is doing. And so if things happen that we don't understand, oftentimes it's marked up in medieval Judaism to the unknowableness of God. This also provides flexibility for people to handle tragedy and keep their faith through suffering. Covenant or Torah becomes synonymous with the Talmud, really, for rabbinic Jews. The temple becomes a memory, it becomes a powerful symbol, it becomes something that is remembered in synagogues and in festivals, but obviously sacrifice and temple worship is not possible in the Middle Ages. We are looking at Torah as it is lived and taught through synagogues in this period. And finally, Israel. The Israel in the Middle Ages is really a focus, yes, the place, the memory of the place, but Israel is really focused on the community and the survival of the community in the Middle Ages. So we have ethical monotheism, Torah, Talmud, and Israel, the community, which is our triad of Judaism in the Middle Ages. And we have a vast increase in messianism, or the belief that the Messiah will come within rabbinic Judaism in the Middle Ages. There is so much destruction and so much suffering in the Middle Ages. Messianism offered hope that God will set things right. God remembers the Jews. God will give the Jews back the land. And most importantly for rabbinic Judaism, Jews don't have to participate in that process. They can simply hope. Messianism in the Middle Ages is a source of hope. And it's also a source, rabbinic Judaism was smart. They realized that every time in the 70 and CE and in 73 CE and 135 CE, when Jews rebelled, Jews died. So rabbinic Judaism places hope in messianism and encourages people to step back from history and let God sort out history and to focus on survival. And hope was important for survival. It was also a good preventative to keep Jews, I don't want to say docile, but to keep them safe throughout the Middle Ages. Because had Jews rebelled to any significant extent in the Middle Ages, they would have died. And rabbinic Judaism was hyper aware of how precarious Jewish survival was, and Jewish survival was the priority within rabbinic Judaism in the Middle Ages. Yes, it would be nice to return to the land and have the temple restored, etc., etc. But for now, we're just going to focus on surviving and let God sort out what's going to happen to us. Very smart, very, very smart strategy for survival in the Middle Ages. And ultimately turned out to be effective because the Jews did survive the Middle Ages under pretty extreme odds. Okay, so the cornerstones of rabbinic Jewish practice in the Middle Ages are actually things that I think most of us would recognize consist in many ways consistent with what we know of rabbinic Judaism today. An emphasis on synagogue and on home, on family and community. So there is a core emphasis on community in the synagogue, authority of the rabbis in the synagogue, but also family and domestic Judaism that sort of ingrains practice and identity and education within children for the good of future generations. We get the ritualization of the Jewish life cycle, marriage, birth, death, the coming of age, those kinds of things that serve to sanctify Jewish life at all stages of Jewish life. We get a real emphasis on prayer. Prayer becomes as a Hosea 14 noted the offering of the lips. Prayer in the synagogue replaces much of what we would have seen in the temple. So 2 to 4 times daily. There were organized prayer, but there was, and ritual prayers surrounding holidays, blessings and the request for blessings, pleas, prayers of gratitude, prayers of dedication, prayers of faith. But there was also personal prayer and meditation in which people were encouraged to cultivate personal spirituality and a personal relationship with God, which marks medieval Judaism as slightly different from ancient forms, where there's less emphasis on personal prayer and more emphasis on temple ritual. Rabbinic Judaism offers people a way to have a personal relationship with God through this period, which is also beneficial to the mental health and spirituality of Jews in the Middle Ages. And again, an emphasis on study, and an emphasis on the right authority and the study of, in some ways, democratizing education. And this was central to Rabbinic Judaism, Rabbinic Jews remaining distinct and spreading their knowledge throughout the community. The maintenance of feasts and fasts as a way to keep memory alive, a way to keep people connected to stories, and to provide sort of a narrative self, a narrative sense of identity, of self in history. So again, as I practice Passover Seder, I myself am experiencing Passover, and this shores up my Jewish identity. And of course, the strict maintenance of Sabbath regulations as central to Jewish identity in the Middle Ages, and an emphasis on kosher living. So Jews had restricted freedom of movement because they had to live with other Jews so they could have access to things like a kosher butcher. If you went and lived off on your own, your kosher practice might be difficult to maintain. So the kosher life encouraged Jewish social solidarity. Now, I have put a video there if you're unfamiliar with the nuts and bolts of kosher laws. I've put a link there if you want to explore it further. I don't have time. I'm actually running out of time because you have a short video that I'm asking you to watch today. But I put the link there, so if you want to learn more about kosher life, then I encourage you to do so. We'll talk more about what that means as we move on, but I've got to boogie at this point. Okay, so, oh no, I'm running out of time again. I swear this does not reflect my disregard for Judaism as it relates to women, but this is the second lecture in a row. This is not ideal. So women's Judaism is not talked about a great deal. When we talk about Judaism, we're often talking about men's version, or Judaism as it relates to men. During the Middle Ages, because of the emphasis on domestic Judaism, women played an incredibly important role in the development of Rabbinic Judaism, and an incredibly important role in the development of Rabbinic Jewish minhag. A lot of minhag, for example, involves food, and a lot of women did the work of food in the home. Women were children's first teachers. We know that Jewish women in the Middle Ages had a pretty high degree of literacy compared to non-Jewish women, particularly in Europe. Jews themselves generally had a higher degree of literacy, at least in Hebrew, than we see in the general populations in the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages was not a period of widespread literacy. Surprise there. Even some upper class people couldn't read or write in the Middle Ages. But Jews had a higher than average rate of literacy, particularly in Christian Europe, and Jewish women had a higher rate of literacy, so we believe, compared to non-Jews. So this puts women in the Middle Ages in this really interesting position of having some Jewish education, being able to read some texts, but being excluded from a lot of the centers of power of elite Judaism. So we see what we can refer to as the development of women's Judaism in this period, where women taught other women and children about Judaism. Women discussed Jewish issues amongst themselves, and a lot of the times rabbis, men, Jewish men, didn't actually fully understand women's Judaism. So as we go through this unit and into the next unit, we will talk more about the specific obligations of Jewish women, because there are gendered obligations within Judaism. We will talk about the development of some of the unique practices of Jewish women in different communities. But in the Middle Ages, the important thing to know is that while we think about the Middle Ages as being very patriarchal, male-dominated, and to some extent that is true, you should never consider Jewish women to be powerless in this period. High degree of literacy, a high degree of education compared to non-Jewish women, and a high degree of financial and public life responsibilities. Jewish communities in the Middle Ages were not gendered in exactly the same ways as non-Jewish communities. We know in much of the Jewish Middle Ages, it's actually women that do a lot of the financial business of a family. Men were supposed to spend more time studying and praying, and it's actually women Jewish women that we see in the market, for example. So a lot of Jewish women did the business of families. And in the Middle Ages, although there is not gender equality anywhere in the Middle Ages, for the most part, not in the so-called Old World anyway, amongst Jewish families, we get a sense of the dual householder, that the husband and the wife are the key to domestic Judaism, and both have obligations and responsibilities and a certain amount of power within the household. It's very heteronormative, and we'll talk about what that means in Unit 3, but don't consider Jewish women to be powerless or silent or non-existent simply because most of our sources in this time period ignore them. They ignored them at their peril. You should be aware that women and women's communities had a very vibrant women's Judaism running alongside men's Judaism during this period. And in the modern period, we're trying to reconcile these things and bring them back so that we have Judaism and not women's Judaism and men's Judaism. But in the Middle Ages, one of those Judaisms with the plural, with the S, that I've been talking about is women's Judaisms. And we'll look more at that when we have time. Okay, so you have a short film that I'm going to ask you to watch, about 26 minutes long. And this looks at several key synagogues that come from different times and places. So it's important, first of all, because it's important for you to get an understanding of Jewish ritual space. If you've never been in a synagogue, if you've never visited a synagogue, videos like this help you become more familiar with Jewish ritual space or organized ritual space. Remember, domestic Judaism takes place in Jewish homes, which is also a significant ritual space for Jews. But organized ritual space can be the physical manifestation of Judaism. And as such, it's an incredibly important source of material and visual culture, sort of the stuff of Judaism. History is written into the walls of synagogues and synagogue architecture and synagogue art and decoration. So I want you to look at Jewish ritual space, get a sense of it, take note of the common elements of synagogue geography, like what is the bima, where is it, that kind of thing. Take note of points of differences and similarities between the synagogues that are presented in the film. So these come from different times and places, yet they have similarities. But also, in keeping with our understanding of the diversity that's growing in this period, take note of how they're different. How do different synagogues reflect the times and places, the historical and geographical contexts in which they are built? Where these are not all medieval synagogues that will be seen in this video. They're from multiple different periods, and many of them are actually modern But take note of the innovations and the continuity. How is the temple reflected in the synagogues that are seen in this video, for example? How do synagogues therefore promote continuity with ancient times? So you can find the film through the Laurier Library catalog with the link. I've checked it. It should work as long as you're signed in to the Laurier Library. You should be able to find it. Okay, so reminder, reading week sort of put the course on pause. So the discussion post from week 5 is still active until the 20th, so please go answer that. Just demonstrate an awareness of the normative Judaism fallacy and that you're not going to fall for that. Understand that Rabbinic Judaism is not the only form of Judaism. That's what I want to see in these posts. So test 1 and paper 1 are finished. The unit paper is still in the process of being marked. So unit 1 is done for you. Yay! We're on to unit 2. Please note that the unit paper for unit 2 instructions are already up on my learning space, and you are asked to discuss Ashkenazi and Sephardic traditions. And note that the instructions for the final paper are also on my learning space if you want to get started, at least starting to think about a topic. If you have any comments or questions, please email me. And that's about it for this week, or for this class, for Lecture 10. Lecture 11, we will begin our week on Jews in Christian Europe. And remember to watch the video after you're done this lecture. And I will see you again on Thursday, as well as for office hours at 4 on Thursday if you need me. Okay, bye for now.